Come on. Pop goes the weasel, the weasel. Yeah. Pop, pop goes the weasel, the weasel. Pop goes the weasel, cause the weasel goes pop. All around the mulberry bush, the monkey chased the weasel. The weasel. The monkey thought it was all in fun. Pop goes the weasel.
Good morning. Today's topic is solving quadratic equations.
What are quadratic equations? They're equations with a degree of 2. That means the highest power of any term is 2.
It also means the graph of the function will be a parabola. That means U-shaped. Here are some examples.
The point of solving any equation is to find the value or values that make the equation true. It could also be an inequality.
We've already solved some types of equations. These include linear equations, inequalities, and absolute value equations. Now we're going to learn to solve quadratic equations.
There are 2 ways to solve quadratic equations, by graphing and algebraically.
So when you are using graphing to solve a quadratic equation, look to see where your parabola hits the x-axis. For this example, you can see that it hits it at x equals 1 and x equals 3. So those are our solutions to this quadratic equation.
When you're solving algebraically, there are actually 3 different ways you can do this.
You can take the square root of both sides, set the equation equal to 0 and factor, or use the quadratic formula.
So if you have one side squared and no variable on the other side, you can take the square root of both sides. Just remember that both a positive and negative number square to 64. So there are 2 square roots, positive 8 and negative 8, because both of those numbers square to 64.
So the next one, set the equation equal to 0 and factor. So our problem is x squared minus 4x equals 0. Factor it by finding the greatest common factor. So x is common to both terms. Once you've factored the equation, you can use the zero product property, set each factor equal to 0, and solve.
However, when you have an equation without a common factor, you need to factor differently. Remember, you need to first set your equation to 0. Watch Miss Gratz while she does this on the board.
Okay, so we need to factor this. If you were at Sparks High School and took Algebra 1-2, then we factored this using a diamond problem and a generic rectangle. If you didn't take Algebra 1-2 from Sparks High, then you have another method of factoring. Use that method. Let's review using the diamond problem and the generic rectangle. So with the diamond problem, remember that the constant went on top as our product, and the middle term went down here for the sum. So what times what gives you 3? 1 and 3. But this is a negative 4, and we need a sum of negative 4, so both of them need to be negative. This will lead us into our generic rectangle. Our x squared term is here. Our constant is here, and these are our factors. So to get x squared, we're going to have x times x. X times what gives you negative 3x. X times what will give us negative x. Those become our factors. Then we can set each factor to 0 like we did previously. And solve from there. Another way to solve algebraically is to use the quadratic formula. We're not going to discuss this, but if you're familiar with it, you can always use the quadratic formula.
X equals negative b plus or minus square root b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. Woo!
So how you decide to solve a quadratic is going to depend on what the problem looks like. Take a moment before you start to decide which method will work.
Taking the square root of both sides may be the best. If it has more than squared terms, then you'll need to factor or use the quadratic formula. Factoring is usually easier than the formula, but not always. So the bottom line, look first to decide which method you want to use.
And finally, if the problem is a multiple choice item, you can work backwards.
Substitute solutions into the equation to see if they make the equations true. But remember, you need to check every option so you don't miss any solutions. Let's consider this. So working backward means I'm going to plug in each solution into my original equation and see what gives me a true statement.
So x equals 0 works. But
X equal 2 does not work because it does not equal 0 where I need it to equal 0.
x equal negative 4 works too. Gee, 2 of them.
So since I have 2 that work and letter D gives me both of the solutions, letter D is correct.
Now, if you're in a big hurry, you test x equal to 0 at part A and it works, you're liable to try that first and never get to the others. So remember, check each option.
And you will always have plenty of time to finish the math proficiency test.
That's it for this week.
Have a good afternoon and solve those equations.
Yeah.